Something that seems to be affecting our modern societies at the moment is the combo of a requirement for growth and a requirement for lots of nurses. The growth is for economic growth, and the nurses are to fill all the gaps in the NHS that require lots of nurses. And the two tend to go hand in hand, because in order to fill the gaps in the nursing placements, it's one of the main justifications for having quite large numbers of immigration from other countries. And so the increased immigration increases the number of people, and because they're working in the NHS, they're paying taxes and therefore creating growth to the economic well-being of the government, but also growth in numbers of the population. So you have more housing requirements and blah blah blah. But I've been on this earth for 50 years, and this country's always had this problem with the NHS, in that supposedly the justification for all the immigration we ever have is that we need all these people to come and work in the NHS. But it's always struck me that we have lots of people already in this country who could be filling those roles. One statistic that comes to mind is the unemployment rate. And it's normally in the millions. There's normally at least sort of like a couple of million people unemployed at any particular time. So we've always had this very unusual situation of needing to import people to fill jobs that supposedly local people aren't willing to do, but at the same time have quite large unemployment figures. But this whole notion of being unwilling is a bit strange, really, because people tend to be willing to do whatever it is that society has available. For example, a lot of these people who are supposedly unwilling are quite happy to populate retail environments that probably pay a little bit less than nursing and might have equally unsociable hours. But one of the most common ways that young people get experience of the workplace is normally working in a retail environment. So it seems strange that, conversely, they could very easily start their employment in the healthcare industry. But the question is, why don't they? Well, you can start by asking yourself, why didn't I? So even going back 30 or 40 years when I was in a similar position, why didn't I go into the health sector? Well, the problem with the education system in this country is that it doesn't really function in a way to funnel people into employment. It tends to function in a much more political and propaganda-y kind of indoctrination kind of process, rather than preparing the student for life outside of school. There's lots of basics that we learn, like reading, writing and arithmetic and all that stuff. But there is more to school than that. And I do agree that there should be some element of social engineering in school. It's inevitable, it's just natural, you know. We pass on our beliefs to our kids as parents. So when we send them to school, we kind of want the school to be doing that job as well of passing on our beliefs to our kids. So there has to be an element of propaganda in schools. That's perfectly understandable. But then you enter the murky waters of whose propaganda, of course, and that's kind of a different topic to what I'm angling at here. Something for a different video maybe. But what the schools don't do is really anything vocational, anything that leads to anything vocational. And what we have here is a purely mathematical problem, in that the NHS is a fairly constant. Every year it kind of knows how many nurses it needs. From many years of experience, it kind of knows how many nurses will quit and how many nurses will join in a given year. So it doesn't strike me as being too much of a problem to have within the education system a means of communicating this information to the pupils, in that we think the NHS is going to need 50,000 nurses, new nurses this year, There's currently, I don't know, 1 million pupils in your year. So out of your year we're going to need 50,000 nurses. Here's a nursing course. If we can get as many volunteers as we can before we start nagging people to fill these 50,000 places, hey, we've got a career lined up for you. You don't have to worry so much about all the other crap that we're doing. You know, if you want to funnel yourself into this direction, if you want to decide that at this particular age, that would be great. Thumbs up. That doesn't really strike me as being that difficult to implement. But I suppose there's this problem that I don't know whether it comes from government or from the people themselves. But is it that nursing is a particularly low paid profession with unsociable hours, and so people who are born in this country feel they have bigger goals, as it were, and that if they go down the nursing route, is that considered some kind of failure? Is that what the problem is? Because they're not paid enough, so you can't have a proper life if you become a nurse, whatever a proper life is in people's imaginations. And this is something certainly that's systemic and problematic to recruiting nurses, I would have thought. But again, I think that's just going to be a mathematical problem, in that the NHS, if it had some kind of structure for gradually promoting people to more money as time goes by, and having guaranteed affordable living, and the thing that always made public work better than private work, to stop all the nurses flooding into the private sector for the higher individual daily hourly rate or whatever it is that the public sector always had these more golden pension schemes that come under a lot of pressure nowadays. When it was those golden pension schemes that weren't there to inspire jealousy or to give favouritism to one group of society over another. It was there to compensate these workers who throughout their lives had volunteered to work at a lesser pay rate than everybody else for unsociable hours and doing a more constructive job than everybody else. A way of giving a reward that overrode all the other considerations people make throughout their life about how they want to manage their career. And that was quite a fair trade-off for the taxpayer, in that they did get quite economically cheap workforce for a long period of time, as long as you promised to look after them when they got old. Which, as a mathematical problem, is probably preferable than constantly having lots of strikes and wage negotiations and uncertainty about how much the NHS is costing due to wages year on year for the taxpayer. And it's difficult to know who to blame for this, if there is any blame to be thrown around, because politicians always operate in a very short-term way. People tend to force issues on them that sidetrack them from more systemic goals like this. And it's the old booting the problem down the road, until the lack of investment finally bites, and then they put their hands up and say, nah, it's all fucked, sorry mate. Nothing to be done, we're shutting up shop. And it's not really the fault of the unemployed people for not wanting to become nurses, because by the time they get to adulthood and they're unemployed, it's kind of a bit late to be ushering them into a system they should have been being ushered into when they were like 13 or 14 years old. Too many bad habits have managed to evolve. Too many immediate problems have overridden the desire to do good social work, like affording housing and affording children and all these other things that a young potential nurse might be considering rather than doing nursing. I would like to do that nursing course, but unfortunately life costs too much. And it's this structure, this very basic mathematical structure, that's been ignored, that has resulted in, after the football being kicked down the line and kicked down the line and kicked down the line, that we end up with a politician just saying, oh, we're just going to import lots of nurses, be done with it, and then continue paying millions of people to be unemployed. And it's all just papering over the cracks, it's all nonsense, there's nothing systemic there, there's no long-term planning. And I have similar views on a lot of industries really. It's not just nursing, you could say this for all kinds of different industries. But I bring it up as nursing because that's the one that people are talking about at the moment, because the big issues are immigration, growth and the NHS. And the whole point about the NHS and generally society in general is that it does rely on long-term planning in order to function. And if you just put things in place without any long-term planning, it's probably not going to work. But yeah, it always wrangles me when people say that we need all this immigration for, you know, all these lovely nurses to come and do this job, and that we should all be grateful and thankful. And when we had COVID, we all had to stand outside and clap for the nurses, but it's all short-term political optics. What we have here is a mathematical problem. We have a population of people. We know that a certain number of that population of people need to become nurses. And we can solve that via this thing called education that everybody passes through. And yet why does this thing that is so simple, why does it not happen? Why is it so complicated for something like that to happen? I don't know. A video giving a solution that can never be implemented because it's just too easy.